double murder. They are 2 miles north of parking headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carbon Gia. I'm the one that did it.
Jensen and 17-year-old David Faraday were on their first date. Their plan was to stop at a local restaurant before driving out to Lake Herman Road, which was a well-known lover's lane. Few minutes after parking in a graveled area just off the side of Lake Herman Road, a man parked beside the couple's car, rolled down his window, and ordered them to exit their vehicle. When Betty and David refused, the man got out of his car and drew a .22 caliber pistol. Instead of immediately shooting the two teenagers, the men walked behind the couple's car and fired a bullet into their rear left wheel housing. His intention was to scare the couple and force them to herd to the left side of the vehicle. Sure enough, the two scrambled to exit the vehicle using the passenger side door. The killer then ran up to the driver's side window and pressed the gun against David's left ear, shooting him point blank in the skull. By this time, Betty had already exited the vehicle and was running away. The men ran after Betty, gun extended, and shot Betty 5 times in the back. He then returned to his own vehicle and drove off. Shortly after 11 p.m., a woman stumbled upon the bodies of the teenagers and immediately reported them to police, thus sparking the search for the most bizarre and mysterious serial killer of all time. For over half a century, one question has haunted investigators, journalists, and true crime obsessives. Who was the Zodiac Killer? A mysterious figure who taunted the police, claimed dozens of victims, and vanished into the shadows without ever being caught. This is the story of one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries.
Homicide that took place out on a county road about sometime after 11 o'clock last night. A double homicide involving...
On July 4, 1969, 18-year-old Darlene Farron and 16-year-old Michael Mageau were going to get fireworks for the Independence Day celebrations. But as they pulled out of their driveway, they immediately noticed that they were being followed by another car. Panicked, Darlene made a series of twists and turns to try to lose the other vehicle, but eventually ended up pulling into the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park, only 4 miles from downtown Vallejo. As the couple parked their car, their pursuer also pulled into the parking lot and parked to the left of Darlene's vehicle before immediately leaving the parking lot. But the couple was only relieved for a few moments, because around 5 minutes later the same car pulled back into the parking lot and this time parked directly behind Darlene's car. A man exited the vehicle with a flashlight. Michael, thinking it was the police, reached into his pocket to grab his identification and asked Darlene to do the same. But before he could get it out, the men directed the flashlight into the couple's eyes, distracting them for a moment before shooting both Michael and Darlene. More than 7 shots were fired before the man started walking back to his car. The bullets had pierced Darlene's lungs and heart, killing her, but Michael still retained consciousness. While the man was walking back to his car, Michael let out a painful moan. Hearing this, the man paused, and for a split second Michael could see the face of his attacker, which he later described to the police in detail. Nevertheless, the men heard that Michael was still alive and returned to Darlene's car to finish the job. As a last resort, Michael tried jumping into the back seat of the car before the men fired 2 more shots at both of them. At this point the men had gotten back into his vehicle and drove off. Luckily, 3 teenagers celebrating Independence Day stumbled across the couple and alerted police immediately. But it wasn't just the killings that terrified people. It was what came next. Days after the second attack, newspapers across California received chilling letters. Each was signed with a symbol, a circle with a cross through it. The letters described the murders in disturbing detail. Enclosed were cryptograms, codes the killer demanded the public to solve. "If you crack the code," he said, "you'll know who I am." The killer called himself Zodiac.
Vallejo Police Department.
I want to report a double murder.
May I have your
If you
name
go 1
and where
mile
you're calling?
east on Columbus Parkway, public park, you'll find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye.
And he wasn't done. Over the next few years, more attacks followed. In Napa Valley, in San Francisco. Couples stabbed. Shot. Left for dead. The Zodiac's letters became more aggressive. He mocked the police. He threatened school buses. He claimed he had killed 37 people. But how many victims were really his? Later on August 1, 1969, the Zodiac wrote his first 3 infamous letters to the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. All 3 letters were nearly identical. In crude handwriting, the letter read, "Dear Editor, this is the murderer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July near the golf course in Vallejo. To prove I killed them, I shall state some facts which only I and the police know." He proceeded to state details about the brand of ammo he used, how many shots were fired, and the victim's clothing. He continued with, "Here is a part of a cipher. The other 2 parts of this cipher are being mailed to the editors of Vallejo Times and San Francisco Examiner. I want you to print the cipher by the afternoon of Friday 1st of August 1969. I will go on a kill rampage Friday night. I will cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend." At the end of the letter was an 8-line series of characters including Greek symbols, Morse code, weather symbols, alphabet letters, and astrological symbols. Complying with the demands of the Zodiac, the Times-Herald and the Chronicle both printed their parts of the cipher in their next editions, while the Examiner waited until Sunday to publish their part because of doubts that the letter was real. The cipher was quickly passed on to naval intelligence for deciphering, while the NSA and the CIA also joined the effort. Although, a police chief at Vallejo, Jack E. Stilts wasn't convinced that the letter was real. He publicly requested that the killer send a second letter with more information to prove it was real. Meanwhile, Donald and Betty Harden, a couple living a few miles south of San Francisco, saw the cipher in their morning paper, and having been avidly interested in puzzles since they were young, Donald and Betty decided to try and see if they could solve it. The couple reasoned that the killer most likely started the cipher with the letter I, or by saying, "I like killing." They also used common letter pairings like the double L that appears in the word kill. And with these assumptions, the rest of the message could be decoded. It read, "I like killing because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all to kill." The message goes on to describe the thrill of murder. The letter also says that when he dies, the people who he has killed will become his slaves in paradise. On September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were having a picnic at Lake Berryessa. When Cecilia noticed a man walking towards them, Cecilia mentioned it to Brian, but Brian dismissed it as nothing.
This came out since then, but he told me at that time that he had killed a guard getting out of a prison, and so I did take him as a killer. To me, a killer isn't a normal person, so I assumed at the time that something was wrong. He wanted our money. And I actually laughed at the moment because I told him, I says, "I've only got 75 cents in my pocket," and I says, "You're welcome to have it."
He claimed that he had already stolen a car, but it was, quote, "too hot." After explaining himself, the man pulled out a 3-foot clothesline and instructed Cecilia to tie Brian's hands. After Brian was tied up, the man proceeded to tie up Cecilia's hand. At this point, Brian recalls the man saying, "I'm going to have to stab you people." He proceeded to stab Cecilia 10 times and Brian 6 times. After believing he had finished the job, the man left the scene and hiked 500 yards to the couple's car. And with a black felt tip pen, he wrote on the car door, Vallejo 12-20-68, September 27, 69, 6:30 by knife. The couple, who were both still conscious, were found by a fisherman and his son, and were taken to the hospital. And at 7:40 p.m. on the same day, much like the last murder, the Zodiac called into the Napa County Sheriff's Office to report his crime. On October 11, 1969, only 2 weeks after his last murder, the Zodiac entered a cab driven by Paul Stein at around 9:30 p.m. He requested to be taken to Washington and Maple Street in Presidio Heights, but for some reason the cab driver drove 1 block past their destination, maybe at the instruction of the passenger. The Zodiac waited for the car to come to a full stop on the side of the road before grabbing Paul Stein's collar and shooting him point blank in the right side of the skull. At this point, the Zodiac exited the vehicle from their rear doors and re-entered the vehicle through the passenger side door. While sitting in the front seat, the Zodiac grabbed the cab driver's wallet and tore off a piece of his shirt before exiting the vehicle once again. While all this was taking place, 2 teenagers who lived across the street saw the cab from their second-floor window and called the police. But while the kids were giving the police a description of the men they saw, the Zodiac was mistakenly described as a black male. This one mistake proved to be massively detrimental, as it allowed the Zodiac to evade capture once again. This was because in the dead of night, a police patrol unit reached the scene and saw a man, quote, lumbering along in the fog. This was later determined to most likely have been the Zodiac. But since this man was white, the police didn't stop him and only asked him if he had seen anything unusual in the area, to which the man responded that he had seen someone waving a gun around a couple blocks to the east. At which point the patrol unit sped off in that direction. If the police had stopped the men, or come any closer, they would have seen that the man's jacket was drenched in Paul Stein's blood. But police did find evidence in the cab driver's vehicle. A partial print was found in blood that was later confirmed to be that of the Zodiac. Also, the kids who had seen the Zodiac quickly collaborated with a police sketch artist to try and come up with a preliminary sketch of the Zodiac. By now, the kids' mistake had already been corrected. And so the first sketch of the Zodiac was drawn and circulated to every cab company in the area. In 1991, Michael Mageau, the man who survived one of the Zodiac shootings, had later identified Arthur Lee Allen as the person who appeared most similar to the men who shot him, therefore making him the most likely Zodiac suspect at the time. But despite the circumstantial evidence, fingerprint, and handwriting analyses did not match between the Zodiac and Allen, and the police sketch of the Zodiac didn't resemble Allen at all. Although, police kept him as a person of interest, because they had speculated that the fingerprint found in Paul Stein's cab wasn't from the Zodiac. But before any concrete incriminating evidence surfaced, Allen died of a heart attack on August 26, 1992. He remains the sole and top suspect. Another possible suspect is Richard Gajkowski. Gajkowski was the editor of a counterculture newspaper based in San Francisco, where most of the Zodiac's killings took place. There are a number of clues that connect him to the Zodiac, such as his army service as a medic in the 1950s, meaning he fit the military assumption for the Zodiac, but unfortunately, 80% of Rick's army records were destroyed in a fire, so not much more is known about his time in the army. Although the main reason Gajkowski became a prominent suspect was the long and frequent letters the police would receive from a co-worker of his, who nicknamed himself Goldcatcher. In these letters, Goldcatcher claimed that Gajkowski had frequently talked about committing violent acts, similar to that of the Zodiac. In 2009, Goldcatcher provided voice recordings of Gajkowski's voice and Nancy Slover, the police dispatcher who took the Zodiac's 911 calls when he reported the murders, and one of the only 4 people who have ever heard the Zodiac's real voice, confirmed that the voice recordings of Richard Gajkowski matched the voice she heard on the phone that night.
Code is broken. You have never any way of knowing whether it's a real code or whether it's just a fake code. Don't worry.
The last part of that was even more like what I heard in the first part.
Lastly, in the cipher that supposedly contained the Zodiac's identity, the word GYKE appears, and some speculate this might be a nickname for Gajkowski. Unfortunately, most of the evidence against the suspect are claims made by the anonymous Goldcatcher, who has very little credibility. So none of these claims can be considered conclusive.
The mystery has never been solved, and now one man claims to have indisputable evidence. He knows who the killer is. Gary Stewart, author of a new memoir, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, says the serial killer is his father, Earl Van Best, Jr.
The final and one of the most popular suspects in the Zodiac case is Earl Van Best Jr. The basis for suspecting Van Best comes from the book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, authored by Gary Stewart, who claims that his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the Zodiac Killer. When this book was published, it became very popular among the general public. The author claims that his father lived in California at the time of the killings and was very interested in ciphers and codes. He also matched the composite sketch of the Zodiac and had many strange friends, including a Satanist and a Manson family member. Some of the more concrete evidence was the fact that a handwriting expert found that the handwriting on Best's marriage certificate matched the handwriting in the Zodiac's letters, making this one of the few times an expert certified a match to the Zodiac's handwriting. Unfortunately, critics quickly dismissed the suspect because there was not enough evidence against him. The facial match to the composite sketch was a very loose one, and it was also later determined that the handwriting on Best's marriage certificate actually belonged to the minister who officiated the marriage and not to Best himself, therefore effectively ruling out Best as a suspect. Throughout the late 1960s and 70s, the fear of the Zodiac Killer gripped the San Francisco area and sent the whole nation into a frenzy. Although, even decades after the last letter, there are still many aspects of this case that remain unsolved. Not only is the identity of the Zodiac Killer unclear, but the number of victims could range from 5 to nearly 50. And the translations to his cryptic ciphers are still being decoded 50 years later. Despite all of the publicity that this case received, the identity of the Zodiac Killer remains one of the most popular unsolved mysteries in true crime history.